Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nnamdi Nake, and I host Nationhood podcast. Today, I'm excited to present the latest episode of Conversations, where we bring historical perspectives to current issues. My guest today is Abiodun Ademiluwa, a scholar of the classics and a doctoral candidate in history at Emory University in Atlanta, the United States. Mr. Ademiluwa's work examines Afro-European interactions and especially the intersections of power relations, gender, and violence between Europeans and Yoruba women in the Atlantic world. In the past, Abiodun has researched perceptions of mental illness in ancient Greek and contemporary Yoruba religious beliefs. In today's episode, we will be discussing her work focusing on Africans in the Atlantic world from historical, contemporary, and future perspectives. And without much more ado, I am honored to welcome Abiodun Ademiluwa to Nationhood Podcast.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for accepting to grace the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you about the work that you do. So, for starters, what is so fascinating about history to you?
That's a very good question. So I think the STORY at the end of history is fascinating to me. I love stories. And my foray into the history field is a very personal one. So I never studied history for my um, BA program. So I studied classics. And then I decided to go for my master's. I did a master's in classics as well. So, and honestly, I've even so while studying classes, because classics also includes history, like history of the Greek and Roman world. I was not very interested in that history, maybe because of the way it was taught. So I mostly focused on mythology because mythology is filled with stories. I didn't really see the story in the historical part of the Greek and Roman civilization, as I said, maybe because it was the way it was taught. So, well, after coming from my master's in the United States, I came in through through classical history, kind of like ancient history. And then I took a class in African history, a class on slavery. And that was when I became very fascinated with history as a field. Because I'm like, oh yeah, I don't really know the history of slavery. I don't know the history. I don't know my history. I don't know the history of my people. And no, I never did history while I was in secondary school. So I'm like, oh my God. So there's so much more that I don't know. And I'm like, what's the point of learning maybe the history of dead white people, learning the culture of dead white people? And I don't know the history of my own people. I barely know the culture of my own people except my own lived experiences. So the more I learn about African history, the more fascinated I became with the field, not just history, African history, because this is personal. And as it's very personal to me, so I kind of see why learning about your own roots will be so fascinating because you get to learn what has happened in the past, and that way you get to understand what is happening now. So there are a lot of things that I now understand better. So for me, like learning about the present from the past, I think that's the most fascinating thing about history.
That is a very excellent point you make. So I also think I can relate to finding parallels between historical events and activities, or even just ideas that we gain from history and see how they relate very much to the present. And again, as some people say, if you don't know the past, how can you know the future, right? Or how if you don't know where you're coming from, how do you know where you are going to? Which is another way to put it.
Okay.
So it's also a very personal thing. So I can completely relate to that. I'm curious to know, um, what is the Atlantic world? Because I see that it features prominently in your research, and this is something you've mentioned as well. Can you shed some light on what it means, the Atlantic world, and maybe even talk about um, how relevant it is for us as Nigerians or Africans?
Yeah, I would say the Atlantic world, simply put, is the world made by Africans, Europeans or Euro-Americans, Native Americans on four continents: Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So the Atlantic world for me is a world of encounters, a world where different people from different places met either on land or at sea. So, and I think for Nigeria, the Atlantic world is very important because it shows our place in the making of the modern world. Because a lot of things happened during the Atlantic era, that is like from the 15th to the 19th century, when the Portuguese first came to the Atlantic coast of Africa. From there, a lot of things have happened. Capitalism, for instance, developed. We see the economy of the world as we know it can be traced back to the Atlantic world. And most importantly, one of the most horrible encounters in the Atlantic world is slavery. And yeah, I know some people might say, yeah, slavery happened everywhere, in the ancient world. Slavery is a part of a lot of societies, like is the norm. But what makes the Atlantic slavery different is because this is slavery based on race, So, and the fact that a lot of people, about 12.5 million enslaved Africans, were taken forcefully from the African continent to the Americas, where they were working, you know, for free, because this is like on free labor, and where they were developing the economy of another land. So imagine the demographic loss and the loss of people, the loss of labor, the loss of human resources from the African continent. So this labor, which was supposed to be utilized on the African continent, is being utilized elsewhere. And most times when we look at enslaved labor, most of the time we see, oh, people just working on the fields, but there's also the transfer of knowledge. For instance, the transfer of agricultural knowledge from the African continent being transported elsewhere and being used elsewhere. And one of the works of Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, shows this connection of how the contemporary Africa as we know it, the history of the contemporary Africa as we know it, is reliant on the history of the experiences of the Atlantic world. So there's this cycle that continues right from that era to the present day. We see this cycle of dependence from the African continent on these people. So we get to wonder, how come when in the 15th century, African societies and European societies were basically on the same level? So what changed between that period and now that we see African countries being regarded as third world countries, and then European countries who basically started from the same time, we're basically on the same level, and now we're advanced and they are called first world countries or advanced countries. And we're like, oh yeah, we're developing countries. So the Atlantic world is very important as a historical framework to be able to understand our present circumstances in the African continent.
This question perfectly segues into the next one I want to ask. I mean, the way you've answered the last question. So let us get into the question of slavery specifically. What can you tell us about pre-colonial Nigerian or African societies and the practices of slavery, both on the continent and within the context of the Atlantic world? You mentioned quite all right how most people tend to try to water down the impact of transatlantic slavery by saying things like every society had slavery, which is true. So can you just shed a bit more light from what you know about slavery practices in these pre-colonial societies, maybe talk about what was different between that and the system of slavery, the Atlantic slavery, and then anything else, the role of Africans, whatever strikes your mind.
Okay, do you mean the role of Africans in the Atlantic slavery as well?
Yes, what and everything concerning slavery
Slavery.
in pre-colonial Africa. What are your thoughts? What have you discovered? So part of what we're having these conversations is to speak to some of the myths that exist in history.
Yeah.
So as a historian who's been researching, I'm sure you've come across multiple archival sources, some of which probably corroborate what is popular knowledge, some of which might contradict or at least complicate what people take to be standard knowledge. So what can you tell us about slavery in pre-colonial Nigerian and African societies and how it worked both on the continent, how it compared to transatlantic one, the role of Africans, and all of that together.
Yeah. So there have been several myths, as you mentioned, about slavery in Africa. And slavery in Africa has been used in several ways, with several motivations. For instance, the whole field of history started from these Eurocentric perspectives. The very first historians of Africa or Africanists are Europeans. And so then if we go back to the issue of the Atlantic Quarter as well, we see during the period of the abolition, I think that is when the issue of Africa, like as a field, began. So we see abolitionists writing about Africa and trying to write about things that will make slavery become abolished. And we see slave traders too, or those who are pro-slavery, also writing, you know, counteracting whatever these abolitionists were writing. So one of the things they used was slavery in Africa. Oh yeah, we have slavery already existed in Africa. So if there's no slavery, then how would Europeans be able to tap into the market? So basically, Europeans are basically tapping into the market, the slave market in Africa. These are some of the things that people keep saying. And then we have Africanists, right, trying to also, say, we need to push back against this Eurocentric perspective. And some of the ways they do it is by saying slavery did not really exist in pre-colonial Africa. You know, even when they were slaves in code, we couldn't really call they would say there are forms of dependency, and we couldn't really call them slaves or enslaved people. And one of the things they say is, oh yeah, because enslaved persons become absorbed into the community, right? Yeah, but I just want to point out that there are different forms of dependency in pre-colonial Africa, and slavery is one of it. So slavery existed, as far as I'm concerned, in pre-colonial Africa. Even though there were different forms, for instance, in the Yoruba community, we have Iwofa, the pawn, where maybe a member of a particular family or something is exchanged, given to another person. If I owe you money, for instance, I can give you my daughter or son, like in exchange, and the person will work for you for a while. And then once I'm able to repay whatever I owe you, and then I get my child back or something like that. So this system is there, there's for the sponsorship. But at the same time, there were enslaved people. Because one thing that we need to notice is that warfare rates are quite common in the African past. And so what happens to the captives? They become enslaved. Yeah, we can say, oh, yeah, some of African communities actually are they're very lenient or they absorb the body. Fact remains that they're in a state of unfreedom. They're enslaved people. Another thing is we cannot guarantee that each family or each African society or each person that owns an enslaved person is going to treat the enslaved person right. So, and sometimes people talk about, oh yeah, maybe slavery in Africa was kind of benign. As far as I'm concerned, any form of unfreedom is not benign. even the process of capturing enslaved people is violent. The fact that your freedom is restricted is violent. So there is always a cycle of violence surrounding any form of unfreedom, as far as I'm concerned. So slavery existed in Africa. But the difference between that and Atlantic slavery is it is not based on race. And the Atlantic slavery is strictly chattel slavery, strictly, compared to the African form or some of the forms of dependence in Africa, that is not just chattel slavery. And so some of the people who were also enslaved in pre-colonial Africa are probably so criminals. Apart from war captives, we have criminals, we have people who have violated societal norms. We have people who maybe have been sentenced to death and instead they became enslaved persons. So a lot of things, a lot of slavery in Africa is complex compared to the Atlantic. Atlantic slavery is just one thing, chattel slavery. And it's based on the notion that Africans are inferior to Europeans. And that's one of the things that made Atlantic slavery very, very horrible. So it's also based on the fact that, yeah, there's this innate inferiority. And this kind of philosophical views are being pushed by a lot of things, are being backed up by a lot of things. For instance, the Bible, where we see the curse of Ham being used. So yeah, Africans, because of the curse of Ham, so they've been caused by God in a way like God has already sanctioned the fact that they are inferior. And I also see a lot of pseudo scientific facts coming up during that time. So using science, pseudoscience to back up this claim, also using religion to back up this claim. So a lot of things are happening in the Atlantic world concerning slavery. Because as I said, Atlantic slavery, the fact that it is based on race or the fact that it's based on a belief that one set of people are superior to another set of persons makes that very, very horrific and horrible. So in other words, you're already treating a human being as a commodity, basically. Unlike African form of slavery, where they understand that, yeah, these are actually people, you know. Atlantic slavery is saying, no, these are commodities. These are lesser humans, baser humans. So in a way, when people try to lump up slavery, oh yeah, slavery everywhere, that's why I come out and say, no, this is very different. This is very different from what was happening in the past. Because even for Islamic slavery, for instance, under Islam, slavery is a legal category. But for Atlantic slavery is more than a legal category. It's the fact that you believe that someone is meant to be a slave. So that makes it I think, very, very different.
Very, very fair and very, very square. I couldn't agree more about how egregious it is. But I'm curious to know if this is not, and maybe this is a philosophical question, is that not a modernistic view that we are taking of the slavery that happened, the transatlantic one, in the sense that we are very, no, let me put it this way. So is that not a modernistic view on the basis of human rights as a concept is kind of modern? The way we've conceptualized and defined human rights is something that only started to happen, in the middle of the 20th century after Second World War. That is not to say people were not condemning slavery at the time or that you wouldn't find people who were against it. But is this not, are we imposing our modern views on the past and using what may be too modern a lens to interpret the past? What do you say to those kind of arguments?
I think I'm going to say this. Before the advent of human rights, they were humans. And I'm going to say this, without this philosophical worldview of human rights or the formation of human rights, there's human rights,
Mm.
you know. And even for societies that practiced slavery in the past, when you see some of the ways they treat their enslaved persons, you realize they understand the concepts of human rights, basic human rights. I know the United Nations have this whole like thing about human rights, right to life, right to this, right to that. But even people, I think some of the things we tend to do is we tend to give less credit to historical actors. And we tend to forget that most of these people were thinkers. People in the past were also thinkers. African people have their own philosophy too, just like Europeans have also have their own thinkers. So we are not the only ones coming up with thinking or philosophical thinking. And I'm going to say this, every society understands human rights. And that is why for the Atlantic slavery, you don't see Europeans enslaving their own,
Hmm.
right?
That's
You
deep.
don't see them enslaving their own because they believe they are humans. Others who are less human should be enslaved. And some of the ways they try to back up the enslavement of Africans is to try and use, for instance, I said earlier, oh yeah, this is the way God made it. Why would they need to look for ways to back up the enslavement of Africans? If not for the fact that they realize that humans should not be treated in certain ways. So
You nailed it. And when you say that, it gets one thinking because if you think about things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man that the French people came up with during the French Revolution of 1789, they were very clearly mentioning the rights of human beings. So maybe this thing of people claiming human rights only started after the Second World War can be considered to be correct to the extent that that may be when they coined it in those particular ways. But in terms of the understanding of what humans are entitled to, your basic civic, political, social, economic, and cultural rights, they have always been framed by these societies, particularly these societies that ended up enslaving others, right? So they knew what a human should enjoy and be like, and they now decided
yeah.
others were not human, so they didn't need to enjoy those kind of things.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you just made. Because I remember one of our classes during my master's program, we actually read an article talking about, and also how enslaved people were using that same declaration to fight for their own rights, to fight for their
Mhm.
freedom. And so some
Yes.
of the conversations that happened in class was, oh yeah, because I think the article was saying that they were appropriating the
Mm.
language of the human rights. And I was like, no, just because they did not coin the word human rights or right of man doesn't mean they were appropriating that. They are humans. They
Mm-hmm.
know they shouldn't be treated in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that is what they are trying to say. Even without that declaration, they're still going to declare that they
Mm.
want to be free. And even before the
Yes.
declaration, you'll be seeing enslaved people pushing for
Mm-hmm.
their freedom through a lot of through a lot of means, you know, like running away, for instance, running away, like refusing to work, or sometimes full-blown slave revolts. Even on slave ships, we see a lot of revolts happening. So these are people who understand their rights and understand they shouldn't be treated in certain ways, and they are fighting for their freedom. So when we talk about human rights, just because we have the language for it right now, or just because we've codified it in a way, doesn't mean people in the past don't understand what human rights are. So
I love that. So let's dive a little deeper into this conversation of slavery. There are a number of questions running through my head. I'm going to try as much as possible to see how many of them we can get through. I recall reading an article sometime, written by a journalist who was saying that her grandfather was a slave merchant, if I can use that word, or maybe a slave trader, something of that nature. Essentially, I just want to know what your thoughts are about those kind of pushbacks some people tend to give when we raise this question of slavery. Some people want to say, well, some Africans' ancestors were involved or actually made the trade possible. What do you say to those
yeah,
kind of pushback?
Well, the truth is Africans were active participants in the Atlantic slave trade. That's just the summary of it all. But at the same time, there are a lot of things we need to understand about the African past. First and foremost, there was nothing like Africa during that time. There was no concept of Africans and Africa during that time. So we see a lot of wars happening, right? So wherever, so some of the people who being enslaved, people enslaving others are not seeing these people as the same as them because there's no notion of, yeah, one Africa or we are all Africans. So that's why you can see maybe an Egba person enslaving maybe somebody from, I don't know, or you're enslaving somebody from Egba or something. You can see they are a lot of they differentiated themselves, Oyo and Egba. Even at that time, I don't think there's this notion of, oh yeah, we are all one Yoruba people, right? Like, oh yeah, one. So same goes for other places too in Africa. So there's no notion of, so whatever when I'm selling someone, I'm not selling my person, I'm not selling my people. I'm selling a stranger, basically. But that does also discount the fact that some people actually sold their people. Because I've come across um someone being sold by the suitor of a sister. Like I read that story, I'm like, oh my God, this is so horrific. Like a small boy of around maybe less than 10 years old being sold by the suitor of his sister. So some of these things are actually happening. But that didn't happen at first. Some of the violence, kidnappings, raids came as a result of the Atlantic trade. After it was like most of the time after they had gone for a long time. So we see people trying to key into that trade. And I know some of the excuses that people have given right now, people are still giving right now is, oh yeah, it was the norm in the past, right? And the one thing I say is just because something is the norm doesn't make it right. And even when it was the norm, we still found people who were pushing against the so-called normative practices. So that way, they know this is wrong. But because of profit and greed, because there were other people engaging in other trades as well. And then people understood what it meant to be enslaved because some of them, so if some of people were enslaved and returned, enslaved others as well. They had some of them working on their farms. For instance, some of the Sierra Leoneans, the Saro who came back to Lagos, as I saw in the archives, were enslaving others. Even in Brazil, we see some enslaved people who were buying, after they've been freed, who were buying new enslaved persons and making them work for them, you know. And it's like another thing that people keep saying, I'm going to say, by people this time around, I mean African Americans sometimes, or maybe Europeans or whatever is, oh yeah, it's really African Americans because yeah, they're a very large group in the United States. And I realized that most people don't understand the complexities of the transatlantic slave trade in regards to Africans. So I hear things like, oh yeah, Africans sold us or sold our ancestors. And I would say to this day, yeah, not all Africans engaged in the slave trade. While a lot of Africans did, especially those who are at the top, the wealthy, those who empower the kings, the chiefs, and some people were not even there who just were just commoners, and through the trade they became very wealthy. Yeah, that happened. But one thing they should realize is that your ancestors had parents, sometimes parents back in Africa who lost their own child. Your ancestors probably had sisters or brothers too who lost their own family members. Because people tend to think, oh yeah, because people tend to overlook the separation and the anguish of those who were left behind.
Mm.
And the another thing too is that even though some people were carried across to the Americas. Some people were enslaved in Africa.
Mhm.
Some people were enslaved in Nigeria, working on plantations, palm oil plantations, for instance. We don't see all of this. But people here keep saying, oh, yeah, our ancestors came here, blah, blah, blah. So, like, what about their family members too? This is not the separation of a family in itself is very violent. And some people even did not make the middle passage, right? So what do we say to these people? And that's why I'm saying, like, teaching or learning or going back to this period is very important. One, because some of the systems put in place through the Atlantic slave trade, we are still using those systems till date. The banking system, for instance, some of the conglomerates, right? The money gotten from the Atlantic slave trade is used to build some of the conglomerates we know. I think somebody is doing a very great research. I've forgotten the person because the person came to our school. I was talking about research. I was researching Cadbury, for instance. And we see some of these big companies, some of these big banks, we're actually bankrolled by money from the Atlantic trade. In Europe, they are there. In America, they are there. And even the institution in America is still working against African Americans. And these are the systems that have already been put in place during the time of the Atlantic trade. And note, one thing that is very unique about the Atlantic slave trade is race. And we see race as a big factor in the United States and even in Canada. So when people keep saying, yeah, don't let us not talk about slavery. No, we need to talk about this because the institutions put in place are still there. The system is still here, whether we like it or not. Sometimes we tend to overlook them. And we see also in Africa too, like most African countries. Now, I'm going to use Nigeria as an example. We don't talk nearly enough about slavery, or we don't even talk about it at all. There's this silence as if slavery never happened in Africa or never happened in Nigeria. I like the fact that Ghana is doing a very big thing. Hosting, I think, a return for African Americans to come to Ghana. Like they're actually like talking about slavery and the slave trade, like showcasing the point of no return and everything. I know there's like we have museums in like we have one thing in Badagry, we have in Calabar or something, but there's still silence around slavery. Take me for example. The only thing I knew about slavery was very erroneous. Yeah, Europeans came, took us outside of Nigeria, and that's how people became slaves or enslaved persons. That is it. But now I'm realizing that a lot of things were going on, right? A lot of things are happening, like very complex. And also another thing that because I'm currently working on a prominent slave merchant, Madame Tinubu. And yesterday, as I was reading, I think I found a document in the National Archives Ibadan. So I was going through the document again, and I was just surprised about how in the mid 20th century, right, our relatives like were actually talking about they're petitioning for rights to our properties because she died interstate. And the way they were applauding and lauding Madame Tinubu, I'm like, fine, I realized she's an astute businesswoman. Like, yeah, she's great and everything. But the way they downplayed our role as a slave merchant, they did not even downplay our role as a slave merchant. They were actually proud from the tone. They were proud because, like, yeah, she's principally, that's language, principally a slave merchant. Right. And like even the historiography, some of the historiography I've seen concerning her, I see things like, oh yeah, even though she was a slave merchant, others were also doing the same thing. I'm like, what? Right. So we tend to like downplay slavery or the history of Atlantic slavery. But when you read some of, for instance, the narratives of enslaved persons like Olaudah Equiano, like Ajayi Crowther, you see the pain, you see the suffering, the inhumane treatment of persons like when you're reading when you're reading through these primary sources, like even you, like it's not happening to me. Like, but I can feel the violence. Sometimes you have to like put this stuff down because you can't just deal with them. And then somebody is coming to say we shouldn't do it, we should forget it. No. And I understand that this is a very political issue. More so that people are talking about reparation. Reparation was a very big deal at one point, and I think it's kind of died down, but I think people are taking it up again. And when I think about reparation, because sometimes I think like, what exactly, what exactly would that look like? How is that going to look? What exactly is reparation? But for me, I think the first step is even acknowledging that something horrific, something so horrible happened in the past. Just acknowledge that. Acknowledgement is the first step. Now, an acknowledgement is not going to do anything, but just first of all, acknowledge that this happened. And I think that is what most people don't want to do. I could understand why a person whose grandfather was a slave merchant would think, oh yeah, I wasn't the one. Nobody's saying you're the one, or but just acknowledge like you benefited from this. A lot of people they have benefited from the money of slave trade. Just acknowledge that fact first and foremost. And try as much as possible to put yourselves in the shoes of these persons. Just because it didn't happen during our time doesn't mean it happened a long time ago. And you know why? Because I was even going through Instagram today and I'm seeing that a school, like, segregation in America and our schools are segregated. I think a school in Mississippi just got an order to stop that in 2016. Became desegregated in 2016,
Mm.
very recently. So these are some of the issues that are still going on currently. And then when we talk about the dependency of Africa on Western countries. So some of the issues we cannot sweep slavery under the carpet. We cannot do that. Doing that is just, I think, is just contributing to the issues, the contemporary issues. Like trying to erase the past is not going to make the past go away. It's going to be there, right there, I think.
I think you actually prompted some of the next questions I had, and you raised so many other questions. So that was a beautiful monologue, if I can say so myself. It really, really captured so much and very weighty. So let me start with the question of reparations. So going a bit political now. Where do you place yourself on this argument of reparations? You are right. These conversations are coming up every day. It's taking different shapes as well. There are even attacks on things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly in the United States. I think maybe about 26 or so states, I could be wrong about the number, have passed laws now that ban universities or higher institutions from funding or participating in DEI activities. And so all those Black Student Success Centers, Asian Cultural Centers, and indigenous, student centers that help to give these communities who have been disadvantaged by the history of slavery and deprivation and what have you, a leg up, settling these activities are being defunded. Of course, the United States Supreme Court also passed these laws, canceling affirmative action and what have you. And so there is a lot of stuff going on right now that maybe a lot of people are not conscious of about how people who have been traditionally disenfranchised and disempowered by the European system are facing it again, so to speak, in a manner of speaking. So, with all of that in mind, what are your thoughts about this argument on reparations? I know you say very clearly that at least acknowledge. I think that's good to say, but is the acknowledgement alone enough? Do we need certain things to happen? And if we need those things to happen, is it because we think it is going to help to create an equality of opportunity for, say, Africans in the present? Or do Africans just need to tighten their bootstraps by themselves and jet themselves into the future and forget about, what has happened? I hear what you say about how companies, many of them manufacturing, finance, banking, what have you, can trace their heritage and resources. to activities like slavery, but are those structures still holding people down today, or are people able to, take advantage of whatever lies within their current reach, maybe at the national level, and move forward? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's like when you say, oh yeah, there is no need for reparation, or when you say, or when people say Black people should, step up. I think it's basically saying someone who has a huge stone tied to their legs and someone who has nothing tied to their legs and you're asking them to run a race. We all know who's going to win. So when you have a situation where there's already an institution or a system that is against a particular set of people, what do you expect? How do you expect them to run and win? There's no equality or equity in the system. There has never been equity in the system because we still find some very redundant laws, some laws that have been promulgated maybe during the 19th, 18th century. And we know during that time was a period, a very racist period. So we still find some of these systems right now still happening currently. So people just coming out to say Black people should step up, or Black people, like some of them are actually benefit. Most of the people saying that are actually white people who don't understand. One, who don't understand because of course they're not experiencing the same thing. That's number one. And they don't understand. And even when they understand, they don't want to do anything because they are benefiting from the system. Okay, so I think um I was at a meeting in my school here. I think the first few weeks I arrived, some of the programs that we attended, and someone was talking about how even in the job market, once they see your name, there are certain names that Black people maybe you will not pass through the like you can never.
Mm.
So that you're not even getting through. So how exactly are you supposed to get an interview? And even the old supposed DI thing, which is not being defunded, even when it was not defunded, right? Most of the times companies just employ one Black person as the face of DI. And that in itself is kind of that in itself is wrong in a way because sometimes even these persons are kind of feeling like okay because some of the narratives would be like oh this person is just here because of DEI, like not because of their own merit, but at the same time the person is there, you know compared to now that okay nobody's even there. So I think as you said, this is very political. This is very political. And we keep seeing this same cycle. This has happened before in the past. It's just that it's coming up under different names and under different regimes and under different, I don't know, philosophy. But it's still the same thing. This whole notion of superiority versus inferiority, this whole notion of racial superiority. And sometimes it pains me when I see some people saying, oh yeah, go to school. You know, for instance, African migrants in the United States, or some of us who are not migrants, but we are here to school. One of the edge that we have over African Americans is the fact that education is very cheap in Nigeria, even if you are complaining. So most of us already have like undergraduate degree before coming here. Some of them don't have the chance. And then we should also talk about school districts. Where you live determine the kind of school you're going to go. So
Mm.
when you were born already, so you're already born with this so with these drawbacks or setbacks in life. You're born in a particular place, you're going to that school. And some of these schools are underfunded. So basically, you don't get good education, but you're supposed to compete with someone who has gotten a very good education in another place. You're writing the same exams. how exactly are you supposed to compete? Then we, as African migrants or people coming from Africa here, we also have another edge, as I said, we have our own degree. So we most of us come directly to do our master's or PhD. And I see some of us saying, oh yeah, these people are not working out, but how exactly are they supposed to work at when they've already been limited right from their birth, you know? Although we see a lot of like African Americans making it, but what did they have to go through before they can make it? Some of them are even started with education loans and everything. They are still paying. Some of them don't even have the opportunity to even go to university. But we don't see that because we see America as an advanced country. And because most of the times we don't put ourselves in their shoes, so we don't really know what they're going through. So some of us see them as, yeah, not doing enough. But they actually, some of them, they are doing the best that they can, given the opportunities that they've been given. And so I think the best form of preparation would be to dismantle the system, as far as I'm concerned. Because even if you continue with the DEI, how many people, how many people will get the opportunity or benefit from DEI? How many people? So if the system is still in place, basically nothing's gonna change. Very little to nothing's gonna change. So
One has to wonder if the people who are currently benefiting from the system are the ones who are going to try to change it. I don't know if you have an answer for that. What do you think? Do you think because when you think about it, and I tend to agree with a lot of what you say about dismantling the system. What I'm not just able to put a finger on at the moment is maybe the how. I feel like these DEI programs are very useful, like you mentioned, because in the end, the person is at least there. If you take the DEI program away, then they are not even there at all. And so one news article was saying, for example, that this year, for the first time, Harvard has seen a drop in the enrollment of Black students, since this affirmative action thing was passed. So that means the ability of Harvard to maintain a certain quota or number of Black people was because of these laws that were put in place to help make sure that at least more Black people are getting educated. Let's leave the question of how many people can even benefit from those programs, like you mentioned, a very valid question. How many can get it? But then if you take it away, it means you reduce even further the opportunities for Black people. And then the other questions
exactly.
that come up, like I've heard people say, important people to say things like, look, with all the DEI that's been going on for the past decade or so, you still don't have more than maybe 5 or 6 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500. There were maybe none before, and now maybe there are 3 of them or 6 of them. Still a drop, a blip. If you ask me, it still comes to what you say about it's something. There are some people in there, and the way I take it further is to wonder how can we improve that number. But I'm really, really curious to know if you have any thoughts about how we could, break this system down.
Honestly, I don't know. I don't know because this is like starting all over in a way. It's like starting all over. And starting over is not, it has never been easy and it's not easy. That's one. And then trying to dismantle the system. Like right now, I'm not sure that's going to happen because we have a lot of people benefiting from the system. We're not going to let that happen. And some of these people, we have them, some of them are professors, some of them are CEOs, some of them are judges, basically they're in all facets of life. They're everywhere in the system. They are doctors, you know. So I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how that is going to happen. I don't know how that is going to happen. But I'm really just going to say this. The only thing I'm going to say is people need to keep pushing for that to happen. And one thing I like about the Black spirits is that people, right from the days of Atlantic slavery, people have been pushing for their freedom and they are continuing to do this. So I'm going to say relentlessly, like, continue. Keep, like, talking about these things, keep trying to change. As we change ourselves, also trying to change the people around us as well. and then speaking up all the time, speaking up for ills in the society, speaking against the system. I believe if we keep pushing, it's going to happen one day. When, I don't know. Or we can't say because, oh yeah, we are stormed, we don't know that's going to happen, then we stop. Because when we stop, that means we've lost. So I'll just keep pushing. And some of the ways people are doing that is getting an education, with, like whether it's very hard to or not. And those who cannot get an education, like trying to do something in their lives. Like people are building a lot of businesses, there are a lot of small businesses. And this is acts of resilience. This is kind of resistance in a way. Building business, people are building businesses and people are making sure that their generation, like they are trying as much as possible to make the lives of their generations better, as they're making their own lives better. People are making better choices. I know it's not easy. But one day, hopefully, one day, once we keep talking about these things and we keep pushing,
I want to bring.
maybe not
I
today.
want to bring. Okay, sorry. I interrupted your thought there. I agree with you that the spirit is to keep pushing, and I want to bring together two things you've mentioned at different points in the conversation. One has to do with the dichotomy between Africans from the continent, like you and I want to say Africans, which is what our brethren who are from the Americas are, but maybe to use the more common term, which they themselves apply, to say black. So people from the Caribbean, the Americas, and what have you, there's a dichotomy between them and Africans from Africa, much of it around this experience of slavery and how to interpret it. The other part of it is this lack of historical consciousness that we in Africans have about slavery, which is the complete opposite of what Black Americans, Black Canadians have. I'm not saying Africans don't know about slavery, but the way we interpret it and the way it has affected our lives and all that. And it's not because it has not affected our lives, as you mentioned, but we just don't have this historical consciousness of it. For example, as you say, people were taken away and there were some people who were left behind. There must have been some emotional trauma coming from that. And yet, there's division between Africans who found themselves in the Americas and Africans who were left behind. Is there a coming together that needs to happen between these two kind of Africans? I've had a Black American ask me if I consider myself Black because I'm from the continent. And they didn't mean that in any bad way, but they were just conscious of this kind of political divide of how they are, how they bear this idea of what's happened to their great grandparents and grandparents, while we from Africa have our own notions of, what it is. And in fact, sometimes it's even Africans from Africa that hear saying, why are these Black Americans going on and on about all these things? What is it with these Black Canadians and slavery? Slavery is in the past. This is Africans talking about it. So is it because they lack the consciousness of what has happened? And then you have, these Black Canadians, Black Americans who feel maybe these are people from Africa, they don't know what's up. They're not up to date. They've not seen what we've seen, and stuff like that. And so even ab initio, maybe there's division going on. So I know those are a lot of conversations, questions going on around there. But I'm just curious to know what are your thoughts about this, division between Africans in the Americas and Africans in Africa, and how we can begin to come together. Is history the solution to this problem? Digging back to uncover what has happened to move ahead. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think history is the solution. Yeah, I'm just gonna say that. As you said rightly, there's this lack of historical consciousness, right? On the part of Africans from the continent and on the part of some African Americans or like Black people in the diaspora or outside of Africa. Because sometimes I hear African Americans say some things like, oh yeah, Africans back in the continent, like they didn't suffer. One, they sold their brothers. That's number one. They sold us one. They are enjoying in Africa, right? And then they will now come here again, take our jobs. Second of it, these are some of the narratives that I've heard.
Yes, this is true.
And then Africans from the continent coming here, right? And they're like, okay, these people are lazy. Imagine, like, an average Nigerian is hardworking, normal, like
Ready to
hustler.
hustle. They
Yeah,
say these
you
guys, they're
also.
living on government check. Every time they are waiting for their
Yes,
benefits. They have so many children that are giving their benefits. They don't want to do anything, stuff like that. I've heard this kind of
yes,
comment.
yes. So, and I'm like, what you can see here is a clear division, right? It's kind of like this divide and conquer, in a way. One thing we need to understand that whether you are an African or a Black person, sort of Africa, or you're a Black person in Africa or an African, whatever you are, we all have one thing in common: European imperialism. That is one thing we need to understand. Because I've also had people say, oh, yeah, whatever benefits that Africans in America, Canada are enjoying right now is because the Black people there who were sold into slavery were the ones who fought for that. That we are just coming here to just, you know,
Enjoy.
reap the benefits, enjoy, not realizing that Africans also went through colonialism in Africa. And we too are feeling like this is our great grandfather's money in a way. Like we also deserve to reap the benefit. And the funny thing is, even what is even the benefits? That's the thing. Because if there is a lot of benefits here, then African Americans won't be suffering. The system is still rigged against African Americans. So in other words, it's still rigged against all Black people, whether you're an African migrant or not. So we need to understand that there is a common enemy, and that is the imperialistic system already put in place. And that is what we need to fight. I went to a place in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and I think that they opened my eyes to some of the things. Like, oh yeah, I read about racism. That was when I first arrived in the United States. I think my first semester here. Fine, I know like racism and everything, because at times I was wondering, like, we also, you have some opportunities here. Take the opportunity. And then I went, there's this town. This is 2021. There's this town. And then somebody was telling me, like, this place is at a very beautiful place. There's this lake. We have these beach houses, beautiful. And we were the only Black people walking on the street. Later we saw like a Black man or something at the beachfront. But most of the people we've seen, like I think we basically just saw one Black person apart from us. And the guy walking us through the place was telling us that there are no Black people living in that side of the city, in that part of the city. The Black people are living at the other side of the city. And that if we are not careful, someone might even call a cop on us, because what are we doing there? And that this person was even telling us that some of the Black people, right? It was the one because this person is an African, he was the one even who told them about this part of the city. They don't know that part exists. And that was when it dawned on me, like, racism is very, 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 like, is persistent and very, very present in the American system. Like, it was just that one day that I realized. I started thinking about some of the things they were going through, right? But at the same time, too, I think there's a need for dialogue between Africans from the continent and Africans here, because they also need to understand our own struggles. Some Africans left their countries not because they wanted to, but because of the situation. And whether we blame our bad governments or whatever, the fact still remains that, like, a continent that went through slavery, that went through colonialism, we still have these consequences with us till now. There's already this huge difference between African countries rather, and Western countries, even before independence. So it's basically like gaining independence and everything is already basically like destroyed in a way. You are trying to run a race and you're already tied down with a lot of maybe debt or something. You're trying to, how can you recuperate from centuries of trauma in how many years? I'm not saying some of our leaders are not corrupt. I'm not saying that. But even during the colonial period, there was corruption. Some corruption are even tied to the colonial period, whether we like it or not. So there needs to be a dialogue. We need to sit down and talk and understand that we are all in this, we're in the same boat. This struggle is for everybody. And then do you remember during the time when Pan-Africanism was a thing? There was a time when there was dialogue between Africans on the continent and African Americans here. You see Martin Luther King going to Ghana, for instance. We see thinkers in on both sides of the sea
The civil
discussing, having
rights
dialogue.
movement
Yes,
gaining a lot of giving a lot of support to independence movement and vice versa, all happening at the same
exactly.
time in the 60s, the 70s.
Exactly. Very sudden. I don't understand what is wrong with that generation. Very sudden. It's as if that never happened. And I know why it's that way. Because some of us don't even know that even happened in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Nigeria, as I said, I never studied history in Nigeria because history was not composed when I was in secondary school. So how am I supposed to know that? That is one. Then secondly, some of the histories in Africa, like in most African schools, are nationalist histories, talking about how they became a nation, just focusing on the nation. There's even no dialogue within the African continent. So how would there be dialogue between Africa and then Africa's like so history is very, very important. We need to bring
Mm.
history back to schools and not just nationalist history. Start from the beginning, pre-colonial, because pre-colonial is also very important. One thing that I
Yeah.
like about pre-colonial history is that it shows that Africa had history before the advent of the Europeans. Because most people think African history started only when the Portuguese came to Africa. No, that's a lie. And our history is not tied to slavery. African history is bigger than the history of the transatlantic slavery. So, as I said, history is very important though. Like every facet of like every aspect of the of our historical past, whether before the colonial period, whether before the Atlantic slave trade, during, after, we need to talk about these things. And when we know, because knowledge is power, whether we like it or not, what you don't know, how can you talk about what you don't even understand? Because sometimes I go on social media and I see some of the things people say. I get really mad
Mm-hmm.
because I get really, really, really mad. Then one time because one day I told myself, like, I have to sit down, like, okay, some years back, I probably would have been thinking the same way because I did not know. I did not know.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't know, then how are you supposed to deal with certain issues?
Yeah.
I see some, one thing about, okay, I'm going to mention IG again because I go on IG almost all the time. I don't engage, but it's a way to see how people think because people are really, really open on Instagram. They say
Yeah.
stuff.
Mm.
And you see them talking about the state of the nation, for instance, or commenting on like American history, for instance, or slavery, for instance. And some of the things they say, for instance, colonialism, people saying they should bring colonial masters back. I'm like, first, do you even
You're
know what
wondering,
that means?
do you really know what you're asking for when you make
Do you
such a
know what you're
comment?
asking for?
Do you have
Or
an
people
idea?
catching crews with
Mm.
if they take us as slaves, I will enter the ship myself. Like, do you even know what that means? So I think we need to bring history back. History is very important. It's the fact that I understand why people think history is not important because some the way we've been conditioned is to go to school for and study a course that will give you money, right? And so what is because and then another thing too is some people don't understand the importance of the humanities, for instance, because in a way they don't take it as tangible. It's not something you can hold, right? A doctor saves lives. We can see that. So what exactly does history do? I know some of these comments are very like very reductive and redundant because they don't understand. People think, oh yeah, sciences. I'm like, oh the world revolves around the humanities. The world, whether we like it
Absolutely.
or not, it revolves around
Absolutely.
the humanities. But people do not understand, especially the scientists. I'm sorry, I have to call them out. Because most of some of my friends are actually in the sciences. And some of the things they say, it amazes me, right? And sometimes I just get tired of trying to explain the relevance of what I'm doing or the relevance of what history does or something. Because I'm like, when you people say some things, I look at you so surprised, like, how would you even think that way?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, if you actually have like done history, you would understand better. And then say some things, So I think I'm gonna stop there.
That's an excellent place to move into the next question, which is related to the last point you're just making. I'm curious to know how far back your research goes, and maybe if there are any interesting stories. You already alluded to some actually, but just something to, maybe move a little away from the political side of it. Just interesting stories you've encountered in the course of work. You've spoken about Madame Tinubu. You've spoken about the guy who was trying to sell the younger brother to his betrothed or his spouse, and those interesting little tidbits of, historical incidents. So tell us, how far back does your research go, and are there any interesting stories you want to tell? Maybe encounters of Yoruba women in the Atlantic world, things you found in some, some sources.
Yeah, so about how far back, I would love to, if I get the sources, I would love to go as far back as possible. Like basically maybe the 15th century.
Mm,
Yeah, starting from the 15th century. Because right now I'm still trying to understand my research because I just started research. Like my first time in the archives was last year. Sorry, this summer rather. And yeah, so I'm still looking at I'm still trying like to see, especially when it comes to women. Because one thing about finding is hard to find women in the archives. Women are in the archives, right? But it's very hard to find them. That is one, because sometimes they appear nameless, and mostly because you don't find like a whole book of document saying women in blah blah blah, So it might be hard to find,
okay.
but hopefully I'm going to find some.
Okay.
So, but someone before I delve into women, I did some research on African like slave narratives. So I was because I'm very interested in encounters, right? So I started with
What do you describe as
encounters.
an encounter, just so that people understand what you mean when you say an encounter?
Yeah, what I mean basically is like cross-cultural encounters, like cultures meeting at some point, cultures interacting, people meeting up, people interactions, basically. And
Does what
interactions from
happened matter? Like, if they end up clashing or if they end up fertilizing each other, are those the things you're looking at? If they
oh
are
yes,
counter purposes to one another?
yes. So basically what comes out of these interactions? We have pluralization, for instance. We have assimilation of some cultural aspect of the other person, for instance. We have the whole notion of otherness as well, you know. And then one thing about otherness is you look at others in a way to define yourself. So basically, yeah, what makes me different from this person? What makes a person other? At the same time, you're thinking, what makes me me? So we see different cultural aspects interacting. We see people borrowing from one culture, or I think encounters are very interesting because you see people choosing what to borrow. and choosing what to leave behind. And one thing about cross-cultural encounters is like it takes many forms. For instance, some of the so-called traditional gaps of some societies in Africa are actually not that traditional. These are like people borrowing from different like cultures and putting them together during a particular cultural encounter. And before you know it has become tradition. So that's why I think that's why like I'm very fascinated with encounters. I'm very, very fascinated with encounters. And of course, encounters also come with violence. We see wars happening. And of course, one thing we've been mentioning all day, you see slavery. These are some of the consequences of encounters as well. So as I was saying, I was looking at how enslaved Africans themselves perceived or what their perceptions of Europeans were. Because one thing I'm interested in is like amplifying the African voice, giving a voice to the African. And as I said earlier, at some point also that like the history as a field came from a Eurocentric perspective. And we see a lot of travelers' accounts talking about what they think of Africans, especially when they first met them. So I started thinking, okay, what? And this is also based on a class I took. I got like the idea from the class I took because we were discussing some of this in class. So I started thinking, how did Africans themselves, those who were enslaved, and now this is another perspective too, because they're the perspective of the elite people, those who were not enslaved, those who were doing the enslaving, who were Africans. But I'm like, what about the enslaved Africans themselves? What did they think of their own predicament? What did they think about their own enslavement? And especially what did they think of these Europeans? Because we've seen a lot of Europeans talking about what they thought about Africans, the old savage African thing. So I'm like, yeah, what about these people? So I was thinking first encounters. And I know first doesn't mean the first time Africans and Europeans met. But first encounters, but it's kind of personal for these people. This is the first time this enslaved person is probably meeting this white person. So I'm like, at first glance, what do you think? What do they think? And I was very surprised. And some of the thoughts were funny as well because one account said, thought the white man was ugly. Like, okay, this is funny. I love that because we see the notion of beauty, right? And we see the standards of beauty that makes a white person beautiful, where a black person is not. Then we see these people thinking at first glance, like, who is this person? Why is this person pale?
Mhm.
What happened to this person's color?
Yeah.
Or this person is so pale that I think this person is ugly because this person does not look like me.
Mm.
So as Europeans were forming their own notion of otherness, Africans too were doing the same.
Yeah.
So, and for me, that was like, so far, that has been very, very, very fascinating. So one other thing too that I saw was, because I looked at the era of abolition. So basically um after 18, early to mid 19th century. That was what I was
Yeah.
looking at because that was the area of abolition. And one thing that I found out from that was that there's also now this differentiation between the types of Europeans. So it wasn't just basically, oh, all white people, you know. So they understood that some were Portuguese, some were British. And they started thinking, okay, these Portuguese people are based because Portuguese carried on with the slave trade even after the 1807 abolition of the slave trade. They carried on. So these people realized that, oh yeah, the British are the ones trying to save us, while the Portuguese are the ones trying to enslave us. They understood that. And one other thing that was also very fascinating to me was the old trope of cannibalism.
Mm.
Like the Eurocentric perspective is always that Africans, as I said, are savage people, they are cannibals. We see a lot of that in Travis accounts. Or we see
Yeah.
this Africans saying Europeans are cannibals. And there's even evidence for it because there was this ship that like the enslaved persons revolted. And when they were taking down their testimonies, they basically said they saw the ship crew cutting up somebody and cooking them. Whether this
Wow.
was true or not, I don't know, but they said that's what they saw.
That's how
And the
they
funny thing
remembered
was,
it.
and sometimes, and the thing is, sometimes because historians kind of interpret some things as you said, remembrance, or that's how they viewed it. Yeah, in a way, some of them viewed some of this trope of cannibalism wasn't like literal, right? It was because of the slave trade was like according to them, like it was kind of like consuming people entering a ship and they never return. It's kind of like eating up people in
Mhm.
a way. But at the same time, too, people were actually eating people. And I'm going to say this because during that time in Europe, there's this old fetish notion of using like parts of human beings for medicinal purposes.
Mm.
So what would you call that? Cannibalism, because
Cannibalism.
exactly. And I'll not discount the testimonies of these people who said they saw these people like butchering some of the people that died and cooking them up or forcing them, like even forcing them to eat. I'm not going to discount them and say it's just all in their heads. No, fine. It's like conducting historical research means trying to remove biases and everything. At the same time, I'm not going to reduce, you know, the notions of these people, their own perspectives by just saying, yeah, maybe they just thought about it. They said they saw it. And for me, if they said they saw it, I'm going to write that they said that they saw it.
Yeah.
And so I think the whole notion of cannibalism for me was very important because it made me realize that Europeans are not the prerogatives of otherness or othering other people. Africans were doing the same thing. And it just shows that everyone at that time were on the same level. So there's no notion of superiority or inferiority. You know, this old thing discounts the whole notion of racial superiority. No.
I really, I'm having so much fun here. I wanted to ask you maybe two questions more, and then you tell me how you're feeling if you want us to go further after that. So, first of all, this idea of assimilation, and also, cross-cultural fertilization that happens during the encounters. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about things like the transfer of religious practices or medical practices. Sometimes there's a convergence between the two, medical and traditional medicine or spiritual things that happen. I remember taking a course once with a professor of the Atlantic world, and some of the materials we read were discussing how um, African medicines were put to good use in the Americas by the slave owners, for example, when they would identify one or two persons who were skilled in administering treatment using local herbs, that person might end up becoming like the doctor, in quotes, for enslaved people who fall ill and what have you. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. Some of it comes with incantations and religious practices. As a matter of fact, I ran into someone at the airport this year in Bogota who is from Curacao, which is in the Americas. It was colonized by the Dutch. And growing up, she's a TV presenter today, but she grew up as a Shango priestess, something like that. The priestess is not the right word because her grandmom was the priestess. So she was the assistant to the priestess in the shrine. And, people, Curacao is a small island, maybe less than 100,000 people or something. I may be exaggerating the figure, but just to give you a sense of how small it is, it's almost like difficult to find on the map unless you really know about it or you're going there for something. But the practice of, Yoruba traditional religion is alive and well, at least within this person's family. And then you find that happening in a lot of other, you know, communities in the Americas. And you have that in Cuba, you have that in maybe Colombia and all that stuff. people are talking about orishas and what have you. So that's just one example, you know. So I know very well that this is happening. But just from your own research, tell me, are you seeing anything of interest in that area, or all of this has been exhausted already by people who've worked on that in the past, and there are more interesting things to talk about today from this perspective?
Okay, so from my research, right, as I said, I'm still trying to define my research, and I might eventually look into that because we see some of as you mentioned, cultural retention outside of the African continent. The Yoruba example that you gave is like one of the many examples. It's really like we see them in, as you mentioned, Cuba, Brazil, Candomblé, and all that. So we see all of these films, and they're very, very important reminder of encounters, and also of resilience, right? Because to think that this religious practices and this knowledge, this medical knowledge still exists outside, apart from the fact that it shows resilience, it also shows how Africans' ways of knowing, African knowledge were taken out of Africa to be used in other places. But for my research, I'm actually thinking of staying in Yoruba land, but that might change. That might change because staying in Yoruba land might be a bit difficult in terms of finding primary sources. And also, I might actually eventually need to engage because a lot of people from outside Yoruba land, returnees, were returning to Yoruba and they were bringing other knowledge from other places. And that brings me to the discussion of identity. And that is one thing I also want to think about when it comes to Yoruba identity during this period. And that's one of the things I've been thinking through in my research. These Brazilian returnees or these Sierra Leoneans, who most of them were actually Yoruba people returning to Yoruba land,
Mm.
but because they've mixed with another culture elsewhere, but they're returning to Yoruba land. So we call them, because they have a category, Brazilians or Brazilian returnees, we have Saro people.
Saro, Amaru.
Yeah.
But in the end, I mean, just a bit of
Abuja.
a diversion on that. Lagos, Nigeria, you can't even separate your history from these people. A lot of them were influential in early colonial
Very
society. They were
influential.
newspaper proprietors, they were judges,
Mm-hmm.
they were policemen, they were clerks.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the top level positions in government, as the Europeans started handing them over to Africans, many of these returnees were the ones at the front line in terms of this position. This is why someone like Ajayi Crowther ended up being a senior clergyman in Africa. You know, but all of that
Mm-hmm.
goes on for the next generation because he's from an earlier generation. But even in the colonial era, you have, you know, in the post office, in the railways, in the
Mm-hmm.
government departments, is returnees, people from Sierra Leone and what have you, or their descendants are the ones who are in this position.
Yeah.
So we just can't take them out of, they're part of us,
Exactly.
integrally part of our history.
Exactly. So that brings me to my own research because I'm thinking, how do we identify these people? You know, I know people have talked about, yeah, they are Brazilian returnees, but for me, they're also Yoruba people. And I've been thinking of engaging them in my research as Yoruba people. Right. So that's one thing I've been like kind of trying to complicate the whole notion of identity. Like, what do they identify themselves as? And when they returned, which community did they return to? I know they formed like Brazilian communities, but they also had like some of them had relatives who were still around, and some of them like joined their relatives. And sometimes some of these relatives actually help them settle down. So can we just say there is a distinct category, or are these categories interrelated? So yeah, these are some of the questions I've been asking myself. But I think for now, I'm going to engage them as Brazilian returnees and as Yoruba people.
Mm.
So they're going to feature in Yoruba land. And if that is going to happen too, that might mean that I have to like look at Brazil, look at other places that they are coming from, and seeing how their encounters in outside of Yoruba land, how they're bringing those encounters back to Yoruba land, and how that is shaping Yoruba land during that period and shaping the Atlantic world. So yeah, those are some of the things I'm thinking about. But as you said, I don't think, yeah, a lot of people have discovered a lot of things about cultural retention and everything. I think for me, looking at these Brazilian returnees as classifying them as Yoruba people may be a new way of like querying encounters and looking at encounters. Kind of like maybe that's a different way of looking at them and looking at first cultural encounters, because also they were bringing, I know some people, I'm sure some people have also done research on this. They were bringing the culture from Brazil. We have in Lagos, for instance, the carnivals in Lagos. And the funniest thing about that was I grew up in Lagos. I witnessed the carnivals. I joined the parades, like followed the parades, but I didn't understand what I was doing then. Right. And then also back then too, we had like a family friend whose grandparents were Brazilian returnees. My mom's friend, her dad was a Brazilian returner. I never met the man. I just knew they were Brazilian returnees. That's the only thing I knew.
Mhm.
And I didn't even understand what Brazilian returnees meant at that
Yes.
time. Yeah. But we were always there. They were part of the campus carnival group. There's a logo and all
Yes.
that. So they were campus, and it was later I realized the color of campus, green and yellow, the color of
Yes.
Brazil.
Green and yellow. Even the name
Exactly.
campus is Brazilian, right?
Yeah. And I'm like, it's like, the funniest thing, the fact that it took me leaving Nigeria to
To know what it
understand
meant. Mm. It shows how
it.
much it actually illustrates this conversation we're talking about the detachment that Africans have from their history. I know what you mean because I know then I used to wonder how somebody could bear Perez or Pedro, in Lagos. I'm like, where is the Pedro coming from? Where is the Perez coming from? These are all Brazilian names. These are Portuguese names that their fathers
Yeah.
answered their grand. There were some people who were in my church then. We had people in Catholic church, a lot of, Brazilians, a lot of them are Catholics as well. So we had
Yes,
a lot of
yes, yes,
Lagosians
yes.
who would come to the church because I grew up in Lagos as well. A lot of Lagosians coming to the church, and these were the names they were answering: Campos, Perez, Pedro. I'm like, these are not Nigerian names. What is going on here?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not Catholic, but I've been to, because this our family friends, the Da Costa family.
Mm,
So they attend Holy Cross Cathedral in Lagos Island.
mhm,
So I've been there because, yeah, doing naming ceremony, or maybe they're having a bazaar or something. We go there.
mhm.
I did not understand what was going on. Like, I never understood what
Yes.
was going on. But now I understand better, because I'm like, oh my God, I'm actually living through history during that time. I didn't know what was happening to me at that time. But in
Mm,
retrospect, I'm realizing, oh yeah, yeah, like some of the Brazilian descendants, of course, they claim, like they always say they are true Lagosians, right? That's most of the claims, like they're true
yeah.
Lagosians. And I understand why they will say that, because most of them coming, returning to Lagos, were the ones actually building, apart from carving like a different identity from themselves. But at the same time, they were building Lagos. And as you said, they were in charge of a lot of things. And they were at the upper echelon of the society, most of them at that time. But one thing I'm also realizing from their descendants is that they are Yoruba people. Like most of them who were Yoruba before they left actually held on to their Yoruba identity, and their descendants held on to their Yoruba identity. And some of their descendants, the only thing they know is the Yoruba identity. Apart from that,
Yeah.
they had like a name, a foreign name, but the only thing they
Mm.
know, their lived experience, is the Yoruba identity. So yeah, that makes sense.
It is such a rich like tapestry to explore. And this is one of the things that fascinates me about history as well. I'm also interested in the material aspects of it. So if you think about this group of people you're interested in, engaging with as sources, amongst other things, I'm thinking about, the architecture of the houses
Mm,
that they built, in places like
Yeah.
Lagos. There's a reason why that campus area looks like maybe parts of Brazil, because they are
Mm,
bringing their own ideas of what architecture is like, the way the churches there are built, the way the houses are arranged and organized. A lot of that is happening. What about the artifacts within their houses? And all those things
mm.
are sources as well. So I'm just as we've been talking, I've been wondering where you're going to go to look for sources. Are you going to go to Brazil to go visit some shrine there and see you know, what kind of information people have kept and how it relates to what happens back in Yoruba land? It's just so fascinating, and there's just so much to explore.
Yeah. There's a lot of things to explore. Unfortunately, as PhD students, we don't have a lot of time to explore these things. So, and I need to be very realistic with myself. The sources are very, very important because history as a field relies on sources. So you need to go find the sources. And I've been thinking of different ways, like how do I get sources? I know like going to the archives in like the Nigerian archives, Ibadan. And I'm also thinking of returning to Nigeria next summer because I felt like it was the time I was beginning to find some things that I had to leave.
You have to leave.
Yeah. So also think because I think they have some missionary records that might be very useful. And yeah, I would like to go there and then check out the missionary records. Like I think that we're going to be very useful. Then I also want to check out the archives at Abeokuta because of the involvement of Egba women in tie and dye production. Since I'm interested in women, so I want to look at Egba women. And Egba women are very important in the history of Yoruba women because we see some of a lot of prominent Yoruba women, people we regard as prominent Yoruba women in the 19th century, for instance, are from Egba. And apart from that, a lot of production was going on in Egba land at that time. So I'm like, okay, maybe check out Abeokuta and see if I can find some primary sources there. Can I also check out the National Archives in London? I need to figure out which exact one I'm going to go to because that also takes a lot of work and planning. But try and get there and see there's a lot of records and the early colonial records as well because that dealt with the 19th century. But I'm also thinking too, I don't know if I can, I'm just saying, I don't know if I can do everything. But I've been hearing people say there are a lot of Portuguese documents too, because as you mentioned, as we all know, like the Portuguese were the first people to come to African coast. So some of the Portuguese documents or maybe accounts might be very important. They might mention like women or engagement of women. So that way we might actually figure out new stuff or new things about how Yoruba women contributed to the Atlantic world and how Yoruba society was during the pre-colonial period. I know there are a lot of works that a lot of scholars have done very great research. One is the history of Yoruba by Akinwumi Ishola, using an interdisciplinary approach, using archaeology, for instance, and
Mm.
historical approaches. Like very great work, very, very great work. I really appreciated that. Like, because I'm actually still reading through the book, and it's going to be very useful for my research. So we are a lot of historians also working on that. But for me, I feel like we still need to do more regarding women during the pre-colonial era. There are a lot of works on that. And one thing that as I said, I would like to like go further back in time from like the 15th century because I feel like scholars have done like very great work on the 19th century. So I'm thinking like, what about earlier periods? What can we learn about the 19th century if we look at earlier periods? But at the same time, so I'm realizing maybe some of the reasons why scholars are focusing on the 19th century because there are more sources.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So I think as a student, this is just me trying to figure out everything. Like it's a process. It's a process. I know there will be changes along the way. I'll have to like think about contingent plans along the way. Probably drop some things and take up some. But we see. We see. I don't want to restrict myself. But at the same time, I'm convinced I want to work on women Yoruba
Mm.
land,
Mm-hmm.
pre-colonial. So how that's gonna look at how that's gonna shape out.
I think the
Not so
sources are
sure.
going to get are going to guide you in helping you to determine what is also realistic. Because as you
Mm,
mentioned, resources are finite. Even if you have all the money in the world, do you have all the time in the world? Probably
mm,
not. How are you going to compress all the amazing information you get into the things you want to produce, whether it's a book or a film or what have you. So somehow or the other, there are still limitations that are imposed on you by the nature of the work and the environment in which you're practicing it. So I'm sure you figure it out. But just because we're talking about sources, I was wondering if you really would actually find some documentary sources in Brazil. I suspect you will. And I'm saying that because I know that during the Napoleonic Wars, so this is late 18th century, 1790s or what have you, going into the early um, 19th century, 1800s. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil when France invaded Portugal through Spain. And they did that with everything they had. They did it with their archives, they left with their money, they left with everything, and then they were ruling their empire from Brazil. One might wonder why does that matter? Because the monarchy was central to slavery at the time.
mm-hmm.
Definitely they will have a lot of records if
But
they were
yeah,
not particularly the ones involved in slavery. The merchants, the Portuguese merchants who were going to Africa, Cape Verde, and what have you, trading must have been paying some tribute. So you'll be surprised that you might find some records, amongst whatever the royal family took along with them, if they left it in Brazil, or maybe if they took it back to Portugal. I don't know.
Portugal.
But I just
Yeah.
feel like there will definitely be things that you might be able to find if those kind of records are accessible to historians. And the reason it's interesting is because that's somewhat outside of the area many people are focused on, the 20th century, like you say, or the late 19th century. There's so much work that's been done in that area. So it was just going through my mind. But again, that's the field of history. So many possibilities, right?
Yeah, so many possibilities. And I think the first step for me is to find the amazing sources. That's the
Mm,
very first step. Before I even think about like compiling those sources, I need to find them first.
yeah.
And that's one thing I've been worried about. Like, will I find these amazing sources? Like,
Mm.
okay, hopefully I'm gonna find them. Hopefully.
I think you will. I think you will. And but one other thing I wanted to talk about is like the interesting point you were making about someone like Madame Tinubu. Does she have records somewhere that nobody has accessed, and could that give you some information that would be useful in some other light for your work, or are there other people who were playing in the same league as her whose records might be available? I don't know, but all just interesting, uh, questions.
Yeah, yeah. I think I've been a little bit frustrated about Madam Tinubu in the sense that so I'm basically using Yemiton's biography of her life. And what frustrated me was the fact that there are no footnotes about the primary sources, like the sources themselves. There are no footnotes. Because when
Mm,
you get the footnote, then you can go, you know
and
where
know
to
where to
find.
look for what.
Yeah. So like, but at the same time, I also realized that there have been like, because going into the archives at first, I'm like, oh yeah, I might not even find anything about anybody. That's the first thing. But I was lucky to find like a document of like petition of right by relatives. And like, yeah, that makes like I was very excited to find that document. But then reading through the historiography and like other works, for instance, the work of Francis Shields, I realized, oh yeah, she is actually in the colonial archives. I actually found something also at the Lagos State Archives, a colonial archive talking about our expulsion from Lagos. And like, okay, this is very important as well. I know scholars have already used that, right? But I'm like, okay, but I can also still use that in another way, to kind of like showcase how Yoruba women, and in this case, Madame Tinubu, was actually one of the driving forces in the 19th century, driving the market, the slave market or the slave trade during that period. Because most of the historiography are focused on men and men as merchants, right? And then even Madame Tinubu, most of the time, people the historiography has focused on her as, oh yeah, a businesswoman, but not necessarily, yeah, she's not
As
just
a
a
slaveholder,
businesswoman.
as a slave trader
She's a slave
or slave
trader.
merchant.
She's tapping into the Atlantic market, and whatever she's doing is also contributing to the making of the Atlantic world. So
Mm-hmm.
in a way, so and then the kind of estate or in a way an empire that she built during that time, and how she was very influential in Lagos politics. And the kings were also involved in slave trade. So I don't like one of the ways they've even focused on her is, oh yeah, she was actually against British officials in that period, like, and that was why she was expelled. And then I saw something else saying that, oh yeah, the British were kind of saying like, oh yeah, the major reason she was against them was because of the abolition of the slave trade. So like these are very, yeah, in a way she might actually be, I'm not disputing the fact that she was against um colonial incursion. At the same time, we need to also question or kind of analyze our motivations too. She was a businesswoman as well. And this, so a lot of things are going on during this period. And then we need to, instead of just focusing on trying to showcase the prominence of women, right? Or trying to show that these are women that uh, like move beyond the gender barrier. These are extraordinary women. We also need to understand that these extraordinary women were involved in horrific trade and were contributing to the horrific world of the Atlantic world. Like they might be contributing to other things, like in good ways, but at the same time, this is still there, and we need to talk about this as well. So.
That is an amazing, amazing place to live it. Speaking about how complicated history is. And I always like to say that we don't necessarily have to have the answers to the questions, but it is good to put the questions on the table and, let people at least have that in their perspective. Who knows? Somebody might find the answer, but definitely we don't want to obscure certain information in the name of practicing history. Abiodun, thank you once again. Thank you so very much for sharing insights with me on your research. And we're very happy that you came to join us on Nationhood podcast today. I feel like we can talk so much more about your work. You just started talking about women, and I know in the introduction we spoke about gender being one of the areas of interest, power relations. You've spoken about that already, Madam Tinubu, and all the things that were going on in her time. So I would definitely like to have you back on the podcast sometime in the near future, probably when you've had some time to get more sources and then, go through them, decide in what direction you want to go. Maybe we then get to talk a lot more about women, but I think your research is very exciting. I think your research is very relevant, and it might just hold the key to helping to reestablish this historical consciousness that seems to be missing from a lot of, African societies and communities. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure talking about history, talking about women, and talking about research in general. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. So, friends, that's our show for today. Our guest was Abiodun Ademiluwa, a classics scholar and doctoral candidate at Emory University in Atlanta. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a thumbs up and stay tuned for the next conversation. In the meantime, thank you for watching.